My daughter Jessica looked me up and down with that particular brand of disdain reserved for secondhand clothing and said, "Mom, you're embarrassingly poor. I can't be seen with you looking like that." Then she turned on her designer heels and walked back into the glass tower where she worked, leaving me standing on the marble steps like a relic from another era. She had no idea that the nameplate on the top floor of that very building bore a signature I'd written 30 years ago, or that every paycheck she deposited came from accounts I could access with a single phone call. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Ruth Fleming, and at 68 years old, I had learned that invisibility wasn't always a choice. Sometimes it was a carefully constructed disguise. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, where the wallpaper was faded but clean, and my furniture came from estate sales and thrift stores. To anyone looking in from the outside, I appeared to be exactly what my daughter believed me to be: a woman scraping by on Social Security, clipping coupons, and wearing the same 3 cardigans in rotation. The truth was more complicated than appearances suggested. I had spent most of my adult life working as a bookkeeper for small businesses throughout Manhattan. Nothing glamorous: family restaurants, dry cleaners, auto repair shops, the kind of places where immigrants poured their life savings and their dreams into cramped storefronts. I was good with numbers, better with discretion, and excellent at making myself indispensable without ever demanding recognition. Business owners trusted me because I understood something that flashier accountants often missed. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one no one notices. In 1994, a young man named David Chen approached me through a mutual contact. He had graduated from NYU with an MBA and big ideas about importing electronics, but he needed someone who understood the practical side of running a business. His English was still uncertain, his understanding of American bureaucracy even less so, but his vision was crystal clear. He wanted to build something that would last, something that would grow. I helped him incorporate Chen Electronics Import Company for a fee of $500 and a handshake agreement that I thought was routine. In exchange for my services, bookkeeping, tax preparation, vendor negotiations, and what amounted to business consulting, David offered me a 20% stake in the company. It seemed generous at the time, perhaps even excessive for what I was contributing. I was a bookkeeper after all, not an investor. But David insisted, and I had learned to recognize sincerity in people who had little else to offer. "Mrs. Fleming," he said in his careful English, "you teach me how American business works. Without you, I have nothing. With you, we both have something." I signed the partnership papers without much fanfare. It felt like helping a neighbor, not making an investment. Jessica was 22 then, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and ambitions that seemed to change weekly. She lived in a studio apartment in Brooklyn that I helped her afford, though she never asked where the money came from. She was busy building her own life, dating men in expensive suits, landing entry-level positions at advertising agencies, always reaching for the next rung on a ladder I wasn't sure led anywhere meaningful. She visited occasionally in those early years, usually when she needed something: money for a security deposit, advice about a job interview, or simply a home-cooked meal when takeout lost its appeal. During those visits, she would glance around my apartment with the kind of polite discomfort that young people reserve for spaces that remind them of limitations. "Mom, you could do so much better than this place," she would say, gesturing vaguely at my mismatched dishes and secondhand couch. "You should think about moving somewhere nicer." I would nod and agree, but the truth was that I liked my apartment. It was quiet, convenient, and most importantly, it was mine. I had no mortgage, no debt, and no desire to impress anyone with marble countertops or stainless steel appliances. Jessica interpreted this as resignation. I considered it freedom. Meanwhile, Chen Electronics was growing in ways that surprised everyone, including David and me. What had started as a small import operation expanded into wholesale distribution, then retail partnerships, then manufacturing agreements. David had an intuitive understanding of market trends and consumer behavior that complemented my grasp of operational efficiency. We reinvested everything, lived modestly, and watched the company transform from a hopeful startup into a legitimate enterprise. By 1999, Chen Electronics had moved from a shared warehouse in Long Island City to a dedicated facility in New Jersey. We employed 47 people, maintained relationships with suppliers across Asia, and had distribution agreements with major retailers throughout the Northeast. David handled the vision and customer relations. I managed everything else: payroll, contracts, regulatory compliance, expansion planning. Jessica's visits became less frequent as her career gained momentum. She had landed a position at a mid-sized marketing firm in Manhattan, and her conversation increasingly focused on client presentations, office politics, and the importance of professional networking. She spoke about her work with the intensity of someone trying to convince herself as much as her audience. During one of her infrequent visits, she mentioned that her firm had started working with electronics companies, helping them develop brand strategies and marketing campaigns for American consumers. "It's really fascinating, Mom," she said, scrolling through her phone while I prepared dinner. "These tech companies are growing so fast, but most of them don't understand American markets. They need people like me to help them connect with customers." I asked about the company she worked with, more out of motherly interest than professional curiosity. "Oh, you wouldn't know them," she said dismissively. "They're all B2B operations. Business to business. Nothing you'd recognize. But some of them are doing really well. There's this one company, Chen Electronics, that's supposed to be one of the fastest growing importers in the city. I'd love to land them as a client." I stirred the pasta sauce and said nothing. Jessica continued talking about market penetration and brand positioning, while I listened with the careful attention of someone hearing about their own life from the outside. That evening, after Jessica had returned to her apartment in Manhattan, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about the distance that had grown between us. It wasn't measured in miles or years, but in assumptions. She had constructed an image of my life based on what she could see: the modest apartment, the simple clothes, the lack of obvious ambition, and had never asked about what lay beneath the surface. I didn't blame her for the oversight. I had been careful to maintain the appearance of financial modesty, partly out of habit and partly out of a belief that money should be earned rather than inherited. I wanted Jessica to build her own success, to develop her own sense of accomplishment. I thought I was giving her the gift of independence. What I hadn't considered was that my discretion might be interpreted as inadequacy, that my choice to live simply might be seen as an inability to live otherwise. In Jessica's world, where success was measured by visible consumption and professional status, my lifestyle appeared to be evidence of failure rather than choice. By 2003, Chen Electronics had outgrown its New Jersey facility and moved to a modern office building in Midtown Manhattan. David had married, started a family, and begun talking about succession planning. The company employed over 200 people and had expanded into retail electronics, becoming a major supplier for several national chains. My 20% stake, which had once seemed like generous compensation for bookkeeping services, was now worth considerably more than I had ever expected. But the money sat in investment accounts, generating returns I reinvested rather than spent. I continued living in my Queens apartment, shopping at the same grocery stores, wearing the same modest clothes. Jessica's career had progressed as well. She had moved to a larger marketing firm, earned several promotions, and developed what she described as expertise in tech sector branding. Her apartment had upgraded to a one-bedroom in a doorman building, and her wardrobe had evolved to match her professional aspirations. Our relationship had settled into a pattern of polite distance. She called on holidays, visited occasionally, and spoke about her work with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she had found her calling. I was proud of her accomplishments, but I noticed that her pride in her own success seemed inversely related to her respect for my choices. "Mom, I just don't understand why you don't want more for yourself," she said during one visit, looking around my apartment with familiar disappointment. "You could afford a nicer place, nicer clothes. You could travel, take classes, do something with your time." I tried to explain that I was content, that I had everything I needed, but my words seemed to confirm her suspicions rather than challenge them. In her mind, contentment with less was evidence of settling, of giving up, of lacking the ambition to pursue something better. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica worked in an industry built on perception and presentation, helping companies craft images that would appeal to consumers. But she had never looked closely enough at her own mother to realize that appearances could be deliberately constructed, that someone might choose to appear unremarkable for reasons that had nothing to do with capability or resources. As Chen Electronics continued to grow and Jessica's career advanced, the gap between her perception of my life and its reality widened. She saw an aging woman in discount store clothes. I saw someone who had helped build one of the most successful import companies in New York. She saw financial limitation. I saw financial independence carefully disguised as modesty. I told myself that the truth would reveal itself when the time was right, that Jessica would eventually understand the choices I had made and the reasons behind them. But as years passed and her dismissive attitude toward my lifestyle intensified, I began to wonder if I had been too subtle, too patient, too willing to let her assumptions stand uncorrected. The day would come when those assumptions would collide with reality in a way that neither of us expected. But for now, I continued playing the role she had assigned me, the quietly struggling mother who needed guidance rather than recognition, who represented limitation rather than possibility. I just didn't know yet how painful that performance would become, or how dramatically it would end. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By 2008, the signs of change were everywhere, though Jessica seemed determined not to notice them. Chen Electronics had weathered the financial crisis better than most companies, partly due to conservative financial management, and partly due to strategic decisions that positioned us ahead of emerging market trends. While other businesses struggled with credit freezes and declining sales, we had cash reserves and supplier relationships that allowed us to expand when our competitors were contracting. David had suggested we go public, but I argued for maintaining private ownership. Why give up control to impress people we don't know? I had asked during one of our quarterly board meetings. David laughed and agreed, but I noticed he had started wearing more expensive suits and driving a car that announced his success to anyone paying attention. I continued to take the subway. Jessica's marketing firm had survived the economic downturn through layoffs and salary cuts, experiences that seemed to intensify her focus on financial security and status symbols. She moved to an even more expensive apartment in Chelsea, explaining that proximity to major clients was essential for career advancement. Her visits to my Queens apartment became increasingly brief and noticeably strained. "Mom, this neighborhood is getting rough," she would say, though nothing had actually changed except her perspective. "And your building? When was the last time they updated anything here?" I would point out that the building was well maintained and the neighborhood perfectly safe. But Jessica had developed a selective blindness to anything that contradicted her narrative about my circumstances. She needed me to be struggling in order to justify her own relentless pursuit of external validation. During one particularly tense visit, she brought a stack of real estate listings. "I've been looking at some apartments for you, Mom. Nothing fancy, but definitely a step up from this place. There are some nice senior communities in New Jersey, really affordable, with activities and meal plans." The listings were for assisted living facilities, the kind of places where people go when their families decide they can no longer manage independently. I was 61 years old, in excellent health, and more financially secure than Jessica could imagine, but in her mind, I had become a problem requiring a solution. "I appreciate the thought, sweetheart, but I'm happy here," I said, setting the listings aside without looking at them. "But Mom, you could have so much more. You deserve better than this." What she meant, though she would never say it directly, was that my living situation embarrassed her. She had worked hard to build a professional image, and having a mother who lived in a modest Queens apartment with secondhand furniture didn't align with the story she wanted to tell about herself. I began to understand that Jessica's concern wasn't really about my happiness or comfort. It was about her own discomfort, with the gap between her rising professional status and my apparent lack of ambition. She needed me to want more, so that she could feel better about having more. Meanwhile, Chen Electronics was quietly becoming one of the most influential import companies on the East Coast. We had diversified beyond electronics into consumer goods, home appliances, and emerging technology products. Our client base included major retailers, and our annual revenue had reached numbers that would have seemed impossible when David first approached me with his handshake deal. My involvement had evolved from bookkeeping to strategic planning. I sat on the board of directors, reviewed major contracts, and had final approval on all significant operational decisions. David still handled public relations and client meetings, but the business ran on systems and processes I had designed and refined over 15 years. The financial rewards were substantial, but I continued to live as I always had. I deposited my quarterly distributions into investment accounts, maintained my modest lifestyle, and told no one about the growing portfolio that represented my share of the company's success. Jessica's career had progressed as well, but not as quickly as she had hoped. She had been passed over for several promotions, and her firm had lost some major accounts during the recession. She began talking more frequently about the importance of connections, about how success in marketing depended on knowing the right people and being in the right social circles. "It's not what you know, Mom, it's who you know," she explained during one of her visits, as if this were a profound insight rather than a cliché. "That's why presentation is so important. People judge you based on how you look, where you live, what kind of lifestyle you maintain." I suggested that substance might matter more than appearance, but Jessica dismissed this as naive. "Mom, you don't understand how the business world works. Image is everything. You have to look successful to be successful." The irony was exquisite. Jessica was lecturing me about business success while sitting in the apartment of someone who owned a 20% stake in a company worth millions. But she couldn't see past the surface, couldn't imagine that someone might choose simplicity over ostentation. Our relationship reached a new low during Thanksgiving 2010. Jessica had invited me to dinner at her apartment, along with her boyfriend Marcus, a financial analyst who wore his expensive watch like a badge of honor. The conversation inevitably turned to real estate and investment strategies, topics that Marcus discussed with the confidence of someone who had read about wealth rather than accumulated it. "The key is diversification," Marcus explained, as if he were sharing classified information. "Stocks, bonds, real estate, maybe some alternative investments. You have to think long-term, build wealth systematically." Jessica nodded enthusiastically, then glanced at me with what I recognized as pity. "Mom doesn't really understand investing," she said, her tone suggesting that this was both understandable and unfortunate. Her generation wasn't taught about financial planning the way we were. I could have corrected her. I could have mentioned the diversified portfolio that had grown to 7 figures, or the quarterly board meetings where I helped make decisions affecting hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. Instead, I smiled and asked Marcus about his work. The evening continued with Jessica and Marcus trading observations about successful people they knew, expensive restaurants they had visited, and vacation destinations they planned to explore. They spoke about money with the breathless enthusiasm of people who had just discovered its existence, completely unaware that they were performing this conversation in front of someone who had been quietly accumulating wealth for 16 years. Later, as I prepared to leave, Jessica pulled me aside. "Mom, I know money is tight for you, but maybe you could think about taking some classes? Community college has programs for seniors, and there might be job training opportunities. You're still young enough to build something for yourself." The suggestion that I needed job training at 63, after decades of successfully managing complex business operations, was so absurd that I almost laughed. But Jessica's expression was earnest, concerned, genuinely convinced that she was offering helpful guidance to someone who desperately needed it. I thanked her for the suggestion and promised to consider it, knowing that I would do no such thing. The divide between us was no longer just about money or lifestyle choices. It had become about fundamental assumptions regarding competence, success, and the nature of achievement itself. Jessica had constructed an elaborate narrative in which she was the successful daughter helping her struggling mother, and nothing I said or did seemed capable of penetrating that story. In early 2011, Chen Electronics made a decision that would ultimately change everything. David approached me with an opportunity to acquire a smaller competitor that was struggling financially. The acquisition would significantly expand our market share and give us access to new distribution channels, but it would also require a substantial cash investment. "We could do this through traditional financing," David explained, "but I think we're strong enough to fund it ourselves. What do you think, Ruth?" I reviewed the financial projections, analyzed the target company's assets and liabilities, and recommended we proceed with the acquisition. Within 6 months, Chen Electronics had absorbed Harrison Import Solutions and its client base, making us one of the largest independent import companies in the region. The acquisition was covered in several trade publications, and David was interviewed for an article in Crane's New York Business. The piece described Chen Electronics as a family-owned success story and highlighted our company's growth during challenging economic conditions. Jessica never mentioned seeing the article, though her firm subscribed to Crane's and she claimed to read it regularly. I began to suspect that she had developed a selective filter that prevented her from noticing information that contradicted her assumptions about my life. By this time, Jessica had been promoted to account director at her firm, a position that came with a modest salary increase and significantly more responsibility. She celebrated by moving to an even more expensive apartment and buying a car she couldn't quite afford. "I finally feel like I'm getting somewhere," she told me during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. "It's taken longer than I hoped, but I'm building something real." I was proud of her professional progress, but concerned about the financial pressure she seemed to be placing on herself. Her lifestyle appeared to be consuming most of her income, leaving little room for savings or unexpected expenses. When I gently suggested that she might consider living more modestly while building financial security, Jessica's response was sharp. "Mom, I can't live like you do. I have a professional reputation to maintain. People expect certain things from someone in my position." The implication was clear. My lifestyle was acceptable for someone of my limited status, but inappropriate for someone with her ambitions and accomplishments. I wanted to ask what she thought my position actually was, what she imagined I had accomplished during my decades of work, but I knew the conversation would lead nowhere productive. Jessica had decided who I was, and evidence to the contrary was simply ignored or rationalized away. The stage was being set for a confrontation that neither of us saw coming, but that had become inevitable. Jessica's need to see me as unsuccessful was growing stronger as her own financial pressures increased, while my patience with her assumptions was wearing increasingly thin. Something would have to give, and when it did, the foundation of our relationship would shift in ways that neither of us could anticipate. The first crack in Jessica's carefully constructed world appeared on a rainy Tuesday in March 2012. I was reviewing quarterly financial reports at my kitchen table when my phone rang. Jessica's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and please don't make this harder than it already is." I set down my pen and waited. "I'm having some cash flow issues. The rent increase was bigger than expected, and my car payment is, well, it's more than I anticipated. I was wondering if you could help me out. Just temporarily. Maybe $5,000? $5,000. To Jessica, this represented a significant sum, a request that required swallowing her pride and admitting financial difficulty. To me, it was less than I typically earned in quarterly distributions from Chen Electronics, but I understood the weight it carried for her. "Of course, sweetheart. When do you need it?" The relief in her voice was palpable. "Really? Mom, I can't tell you how much this means to me. I'll pay you back, I promise. Maybe we can work out a payment plan?" I told her not to worry about repayment, that I was happy to help. What I didn't tell her was that I had recently received a distribution check for $43,000, or that my investment portfolio had crossed the $2 million threshold the previous month. The next day, I walked to my bank and requested a cashier's check for $5,000. The young teller, who had grown accustomed to my modest transactions, looked surprised by the amount. "Will you be needing anything else today, Mrs. Fleming?" I shook my head and walked home through the light rain, thinking about the contradictions that had come to define my relationship with my daughter. Here was a woman who believed her mother was too poor to matter, asking that same mother for financial assistance that represented a month's rent. Jessica picked up the check that evening, arriving at my apartment with an elaborate bouquet of flowers that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Mom, you're a lifesaver. I don't know what I would have done without you." She looked around my apartment with the same familiar discomfort, but now there was something else in her expression: confusion. How could someone living in such modest circumstances have $5,000 readily available? "Mom, where did this money come from? I mean, I don't want to pry, but I thought your budget was pretty tight." I told her I had some savings, which was true enough. Jessica nodded, but I could see her mental calculations working. In her understanding of my finances, $5,000 should have represented a significant portion of my total assets, yet I had produced it without apparent difficulty. "Have you been saving this for something special? I feel terrible taking money you might need for yourself." I assured her that I was fine, that helping her was more important than any plans I might have had for the money. This seemed to satisfy her immediate concerns, but I noticed her looking at me differently for the rest of the evening, as if trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. Over the following months, Jessica's financial pressures seemed to intensify rather than resolve. She called more frequently, usually with stories about unexpected expenses or professional opportunities that required investment. There was the conference in Los Angeles that could lead to new clients, the professional wardrobe update that was essential for an upcoming presentation, the networking events that required a certain level of presentation. Each request was accompanied by elaborate justifications and promises of repayment, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me that these weren't patterns of financial mismanagement. I helped when I could, usually with amounts that seemed significant to her but modest to me. What troubled me wasn't the money. I had more than enough to share. What bothered me was the growing sense that Jessica's financial problems stemmed from the same misconceptions that governed her perception of my life. She was so focused on appearing successful that she was making herself actually unsuccessful, spending money she didn't have to maintain an image that impressed people who didn't really matter. During one of our phone conversations, she mentioned that her firm was pursuing a major new client, a technology import company that could transform their business if they landed the account. "It's this company called Chen Electronics," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "They're supposed to be huge, but they keep a really low profile. Very family-oriented, old-school business practices. My boss thinks they might be resistant to modern marketing approaches, but I think I can connect with that sensibility." I nearly choked on my tea. "What makes you think you understand their business philosophy?" Well, I grew up around that kind of thinking, didn't I? Conservative. Practical. Not flashy. I mean, look at how you live, Mom. You're probably more like their executives than the typical Madison Avenue types they've been dealing with. The irony was so complete, it felt scripted. Jessica was planning to use her perception of my modest lifestyle as a selling point to win business from a company I co-owned, never suspecting that her understanding of both my circumstances and the company's culture might be fundamentally flawed. "Have you met anyone from Chen Electronics yet?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Not yet, but we're working on getting a meeting. Apparently they're very selective about who they work with. The CEO is supposed to be this brilliant immigrant success story, very hands-on, very detail-oriented, but there's also supposed to be a silent partner, someone who's been with the company from the beginning but stays completely out of the public eye." Jessica had unknowingly described me with perfect accuracy while remaining completely oblivious to the connection. I was the silent partner who stayed out of the public eye, the detail-oriented founder who had been there from the beginning. And now my own daughter was preparing to pitch marketing services to the company I had helped build, using insights about conservative business practices that she had gleaned from observing my lifestyle. The absurdity of the situation was matched only by its potential for disaster. In late 2012, Chen Electronics moved its headquarters to a gleaming 40-story office building in Midtown Manhattan. David had finally convinced me that our growth required a more prominent location, better facilities for our expanding staff, and conference rooms that could accommodate the major clients we were increasingly serving. I helped design the new office layout, insisting on practical workspaces rather than ostentatious displays of wealth. The executive floor was elegant but understated, with conference rooms named after cities where we had major supplier relationships: Shanghai, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Manila. My own office was modest by executive standards, furnished with a simple desk, comfortable chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city where I had spent my entire life. The nameplate on my door read R. Fleming, Chief Operating Officer, a title David had insisted on during our recent restructuring. Jessica never asked about my work, so she never learned that I had moved from bookkeeping to corporate leadership. from part-time consulting to full-time executive responsibility. In her mind, I remained unemployed or underemployed, someone who occasionally helped small businesses with their paperwork but had never achieved anything substantial. The disconnect had become so complete that Jessica could walk past my office building every day without wondering whether I might work there, could read articles about Chen Electronics without connecting the company to her mother, could plan marketing strategies for businesses like mine without recognizing that she was describing my actual professional experience. By early 2013, Jessica's pursuit of the Chen Electronics account had become an obsession. She talked about it constantly, researching our company's history, analyzing our marketing materials, developing theories about why we had remained relatively unknown despite our success. "They're leaving money on the table by being so secretive," she told me during one of our dinners. A company this successful should be leveraging their story, building brand recognition, establishing thought leadership in their industry. I think they're stuck in old-fashioned thinking. I listened to her critique my business philosophy while eating the dinner I had paid for, in the restaurant she had chosen, because it was close to the office building where I worked. The layers of irony had become so thick they felt surreal. "Maybe they prefer privacy," I suggested. "Not every successful company needs to be famous." "But Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people small. You have to be willing to promote yourself, to let people know what you've accomplished. Otherwise, how will anyone know you matter?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. How will anyone know you matter? Jessica had inadvertently identified the central tension in our relationship. Her inability to recognize significance that didn't announce itself. Her assumption that quiet meant unsuccessful. Her belief that visibility and value were synonymous. I was about to discover just how destructive those assumptions could become. The morning of April 15, 2013, started like any other Monday, but it would end with the complete collapse of the illusion that had governed my relationship with Jessica for nearly 2 decades. I was in my office at Chen Electronics, reviewing contracts for a new distribution agreement with a major electronics retailer, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Mrs. Fleming, there's a Jessica Martinez here to see you. She says she has an appointment, but I don't see anything on your calendar." I looked up from the contract, confused. Jessica's last name was still Fleming, and she certainly didn't have an appointment with me. Then understanding dawned with uncomfortable clarity. "Send her to conference room B," I said, "and please ask David to join us when he's available." My assistant nodded and left. I sat back in my chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, knowing that the next hour would fundamentally alter my relationship with my daughter. Jessica had finally secured her meeting with Chen Electronics, but she had no idea she was about to pitch marketing services to her own mother. I gathered the relevant files and walked slowly toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see Jessica arranging presentation materials on the polished table. She wore a sharp navy suit I didn't recognize, probably purchased specifically for this meeting, and her hair was styled in a way that suggested she had spent considerable time and money preparing for this moment. She looked up as I entered the room, and her expression shifted through several stages of confusion. First, surprise at seeing a familiar face in an unexpected context. Then puzzlement as she tried to process why her mother might be in the offices of Chen Electronics. Finally, a kind of desperate rationalization as she assumed I must be there for some mundane reason, perhaps cleaning offices or providing temporary administrative support. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I set my files on the table and took a seat across from her. "I work here, Jessica. I'm the Chief Operating Officer." The words hung in the air like a challenge to physics. Jessica stared at me as if I had announced I was actually a space alien or a time traveler. Her mind was clearly working furiously to reconcile this information with everything she believed about my life. "That's not possible," she said finally. You work part-time. For small businesses. You've never mentioned working for Chen Electronics." "I don't work for Chen Electronics, sweetheart. I own 20% of it. I've been here since the beginning." David chose that moment to enter the conference room, carrying his own set of files and wearing the kind of confident smile he reserved for important meetings. He glanced at Jessica, then at me, then back at Jessica with obvious confusion. "Ruth, I thought we were meeting with someone from—" He checked his notes. Martinez Creative Solutions? David Chen. Meet my daughter Jessica Fleming, she goes by Martinez professionally. David's eyebrows rose slightly, but his business training kicked in immediately. He extended his hand to Jessica with professional courtesy, though I could see him processing the implications of this family connection. Miss Fleming, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your mother has been my business partner for 19 years. She's the reason this company exists. Jessica shook David's hand mechanically, her eyes never leaving my face. I could see her attempting to rebuild her understanding of reality in real time, like someone trying to solve a puzzle while the pieces kept changing shape. I don't understand, she said slowly. Mom, you live in Queens. In that apartment. You shop with coupons. She trailed off, perhaps beginning to realize how shallow her observations had been. I choose to live simply, I said gently. That doesn't mean I have to. David, sensing the personal nature of this conversation, excused himself diplomatically. Perhaps you'd prefer to handle this family meeting privately? We can reschedule the business discussion for another time. No, Jessica said quickly, with the desperation of someone trying to salvage a professional situation from personal chaos. No, I'm here on business. I have a presentation prepared. This is about marketing services for Chen Electronics. I could have ended the meeting there, could have gently suggested that we discuss this at home. But something in Jessica's insistence, some combination of professional pride and personal stubbornness, made me curious to see how she would handle this revelation. All right, I said. Show us what you've prepared. Jessica opened her laptop with hands that shook slightly. Her presentation appeared on the large screen at the end of the conference room, and I found myself looking at a detailed analysis of Chen Electronics' marketing weaknesses and competitive positioning. Chen Electronics has achieved remarkable success, Jessica began, her voice gaining strength as she settled into her professional persona. But you've remained largely invisible in your market. Your brand recognition is minimal despite your market share. You're missing opportunities for thought leadership, media presence, and strategic partnerships. She clicked through slides showing our company's low profile compared to competitors, our minimal advertising spend, our absence from industry publications and trade shows. The analysis was thorough, professional, and completely misguided. The solution is a comprehensive rebranding initiative, Jessica continued. Modern logo design, integrated digital marketing, strategic PR campaigns, influencer partnerships. We need to bring Chen Electronics into the 21st century. I listened to my daughter explain how to fix my business, how to correct the strategic decisions I had spent 19 years making, how to transform the conservative relationship-based approach that had made Chen Electronics one of the most successful import companies on the East Coast. Your current approach is too old-fashioned, she said, warming to her theme. You're thinking like small business owners instead of corporate leaders. You need to embrace visibility, promote your successes, establish your executives as industry voices. The irony was breathtaking. Jessica was critiquing my business philosophy while sitting in a conference room I had helped design, in a building paid for by profits from strategies she was calling outdated, addressing a woman she had repeatedly dismissed as lacking business acumen. What makes you think our current approach isn't working? I asked. Jessica looked at me with surprise, perhaps forgetting temporarily that I wasn't just her mother but also her potential client. Well, look at your growth trajectory compared to competitors who've invested in branding. Look at your media presence, your industry recognition. You're successful, but you could be so much more successful if you weren't afraid to promote yourselves. Afraid? I repeated softly. It's understandable, Jessica said, her tone becoming patronizing in a way that was all too familiar. Older business leaders often resist self-promotion. They were raised to believe that good work speaks for itself, that modesty is a virtue. But in today's market, you have to be willing to stand up and say, "We matter." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here was my daughter, in my office, telling me I needed to learn to say that I mattered. The same daughter who had spent years treating me as if I didn't matter, who had called me embarrassingly poor, who had suggested I needed job training and senior housing. I looked at the presentation slides, at Jessica's confident expression, at the detailed marketing budget that would cost more than my annual living expenses, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity. "Jessica," I said quietly, "do you know how much revenue Chen Electronics generated last year?" She glanced at her notes. "According to public filings, approximately $47 million. $63 million, I corrected. We don't publish complete financial information. Do you know what 20% of $63 million represents in annual distributions?" Jessica's calculator brain was clearly working, and I watched her face pale as she arrived at the number. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it? You've been asking me for financial help for months. Where did you think that money was coming from?" The presentation forgotten, Jessica slumped back in her chair as if the air had been knocked out of her. I could see her mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had about money, every assumption she'd made about my circumstances, every piece of advice she'd given me about improving my life. "But you live like," she started, then stopped. "Like what? Like someone who doesn't need to impress people? Like someone who's secure enough not to spend money on things that don't matter?" Jessica stared at the conference table, perhaps seeing it clearly for the first time. The polished wood, the expensive chairs, the view of Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling windows. This wasn't the office of a struggling small business. This was the headquarters of a company worth tens of millions of dollars, a company her mother had built from nothing. "I need some air," she said quietly, and walked out of the conference room without another word. I sat alone in the sudden silence, surrounded by the abandoned presentation materials and the weight of 19 years of misunderstanding. Through the glass walls, I could see my employees going about their work, managing the daily operations of a business that my daughter had just told me I didn't know how to run. The breaking point had arrived, but I wasn't sure yet what would grow from the wreckage. I didn't follow Jessica when she left the conference room. Instead, I sat in the sudden quiet, watching the presentation slides still glowing on the screen, her carefully researched analysis of everything she thought was wrong with my life's work. The cursor blinked on a slide titled "Embracing Modern Success Strategies," and I had to resist the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. David returned after a few minutes, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar family dynamics. "That was unexpected," he said, settling into the chair Jessica had vacated. "I take it she didn't know about your involvement here?" "She's never asked," I replied, which wasn't entirely true but felt like the simplest explanation. David studied my face with the same analytical attention he brought to business decisions. We had worked together for 19 years, through market crashes and expansion challenges, through the death of his father and the birth of his children. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was processing something difficult. "Ruth, forgive me for saying this, but how does someone not know their mother is a successful business executive? I mean, the financial records alone." I thought about how to explain the careful construction of assumptions that had governed my relationship with Jessica, the way perception could become reality, when nobody bothered to question it. "She decided who I was a long time ago," I said finally, "and I let her." "But why?" It was a fair question, and one I had been avoiding asking myself. Why had I allowed Jessica to maintain such a distorted view of my life? Why had I accepted her condescension, her suggestions for senior housing, her pity disguised as concern? "I thought it would make her stronger," I said. "If she believed she had to build everything herself, without family wealth or connections, she'd develop real resilience, real accomplishment." David nodded slowly. "But instead, she developed a need to feel superior to you." The observation stung because it was accurate. Jessica's confidence seemed to require my diminishment. Her success needed my failure as a reference point. By trying to give her independence, I had inadvertently given her license to patronize me. "Becky, what happens now?" David asked. I looked at the abandoned presentation materials scattered across the conference table. Jessica's business cards were still stacked neatly beside her closed laptop, each one printed with "Jessica Martinez, Senior Account Director" in elegant font. "I don't know," I admitted. This wasn't how I planned for her to find out. "Did you have a plan?" I realized I hadn't. For 19 years, I had simply assumed that eventually, somehow, Jessica would see past the surface of my choices to understand the substance beneath them. I had believed that our relationship would naturally evolve beyond her need to manage my life and my willingness to be managed. Instead, it had taken a business meeting to reveal the truth, and now we were both dealing with the aftermath of assumptions that had calcified into fact. Jessica didn't call that day, or the next. When she finally contacted me 3 days later, it was through a text message that was both formal and strained. "Mom, I need some time to process everything. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk." The message felt like a diplomatic communiqué, carefully neutral and deliberately distant. I responded that I understood and would wait to hear from her, but privately I wondered if I had waited too long already. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I continued my usual routine: work, grocery shopping, evening walks through my Queens neighborhood, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like a song played in the wrong key. Jessica's absence wasn't unusual in itself. We had often gone weeks without substantial communication, but this silence carried weight, the heaviness of things unsaid and assumptions unraveled. My colleagues at Chen Electronics were diplomatically curious about the aborted meeting. David had clearly briefed the senior staff about the family connection, and I noticed people looking at me with new interest, as if trying to reconcile the Ruth Fleming they knew professionally with someone who had raised a daughter completely unaware of her mother's achievements. "It's like she thought you were a completely different person," my assistant Sandra observed during one of our weekly planning meetings. "I mean, how do you not know your own mother is a company executive?" It was a question I couldn't answer without delving into the psychology of family dynamics, the way children can construct elaborate narratives about their parents while remaining oblivious to obvious contradictions. Meanwhile, Jessica's firm continued pursuing Chen Electronics as a potential client, though I suspected she was no longer personally involved in the pitch. David received several follow-up emails from her boss, requesting another meeting to discuss marketing services, but we let them go unanswered. The irony of rejecting business proposals from my daughter's company wasn't lost on me, but accepting them would have created complications neither of us was prepared to navigate. 3 weeks after the conference room confrontation, Jessica finally called. Her voice was careful, controlled, stripped of the casual confidence that usually characterized our conversations. "Mom, I think we need to talk. Really talk. Not on the phone, but could I come over this weekend?" I agreed, of course, though I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. This wouldn't be one of Jessica's routine visits, with surface-level conversation and polite distance. This would be a reckoning, an examination of the fundamental misunderstandings that had shaped our relationship for years. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of spring weather that makes everything look slightly faded. Jessica arrived precisely on time, carrying a small bag that suggested she might be planning to stay longer than usual. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the past 3 weeks had aged her in ways that months of professional stress hadn't managed. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the secondhand furniture and discount store decorations that had once seemed like evidence of my limitations but now felt like symbols of deliberate choice. Jessica looked around the apartment with new eyes, perhaps trying to reconcile this modest space with the executive office where she had discovered me. "I've been thinking," she began carefully, "about all the times I gave you advice. About money, about your living situation, about getting a better job." I waited, sensing that she needed to work through this at her own pace. "I was so sure I understood your life, your circumstances. I thought I was helping, but I was actually... God, Mom, I was being incredibly condescending, wasn't I?" The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure how to cross. "You meant well," I said, which was true but incomplete. "No, I didn't just mean well. I needed to believe you were struggling. It made me feel better about my own life, about my own achievements. If you were successful, really successful, then what did that say about me?" It was the most honest thing Jessica had said to me in years, and I felt a mixture of sadness and relief at hearing it spoken aloud. "I should have told you the truth a long time ago," I said. "About the business, about the money, about why I live the way I do. But why didn't you? I mean, why let me go on thinking? I considered how to explain the complex motivations that had kept me silent. The desire to let her build her own success, the fear that family wealth might undermine her work ethic, the gradual accumulation of small deceptions that had grown into a massive misunderstanding. I wanted you to be proud of what you accomplished on your own, I said finally. I thought if you knew about my situation, you might rely on it instead of developing your own capabilities. Jessica absorbed this for a moment, then shook her head slowly. But Mom, you didn't give me independence. You gave me arrogance. I spent years thinking I was more successful than you, more sophisticated, more capable. I treated you like someone who needed guidance, instead of someone who had already figured things out. The conversation continued for hours, meandering through years of accumulated misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. Jessica asked questions about the business, about my financial situation, about the choices I had made and the reasons behind them. I answered as honestly as I could, trying to explain decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time but now appeared unnecessarily secretive. As evening approached, something had shifted between us. Not resolution exactly, but recognition. We were finally seeing each other clearly, without the distorting lens of assumptions and projected needs. What happens now? Jessica asked, echoing David's question from weeks earlier. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone wrestling with the collapse of her understanding of the world. But I also saw someone capable of growth, of adapting to new realities. Now we start over, I said. With the truth this time. The changes started small, almost imperceptibly, like the first signs of spring after a harsh winter. Jessica began calling more frequently, but these weren't the dutiful check-ins or requests for financial help that had characterized our recent communication. These were actual conversations, genuine exchanges of information and opinion that felt foreign after years of careful distance. 2 months after our Marathon Saturday discussion, Jessica did something that surprised both of us. She asked if she could see my office. I mean, really see it, she clarified during one of our phone conversations. Not as a potential client trying to sell you something, but as your daughter trying to understand what you've built. I arranged for her to visit on a Thursday afternoon when the office would be busy but not chaotic. I wanted her to see Chen Electronics as it actually functioned, with all the complexity and energy of a thriving business operation. Jessica arrived wearing jeans and a simple blouse instead of her usual professional armor. She looked nervous, like someone entering a space where they weren't sure of the rules or their own place within them. "This is really yours?" she asked as I led her through the main floor, past the cubicles where our logistics coordinators tracked shipments from 12 countries, past the conference rooms where deals worth millions were negotiated daily. "Partly mine," I corrected. "David and I built this together." I introduced her to key staff members. Sandra, who had been my assistant for 8 years. Michael, our head of procurement, who spoke 4 languages and had negotiated some of our most important supplier contracts. Lisa, our financial controller, who managed budgets that exceeded the annual revenue of most small companies. Each introduction carried a small revelation. These people didn't see me as someone's mother or a woman of modest means. They saw me as Ruth Fleming, the executive who had hired them, who approved their promotions, who made decisions that affected their livelihoods and career prospects. Mrs. Fleming designed our entire inventory management system, Sandra told Jessica with obvious pride. Before her system, we were constantly dealing with overstock and shortages. Now we can predict demand patterns 6 months out. She also negotiated our largest supplier contract, Michael added. Saved the company about $2 million annually in procurement costs. Jessica listened to these casual mentions of my professional accomplishments with the fascination of someone discovering a hidden room in a house they'd lived in their entire life. I could see her mentally cataloging information, trying to reconcile these descriptions with the woman she had thought needed career counseling. When we reached my office, Jessica stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the space where I spent most of my working hours. The nameplate, the diplomas and certifications I'd earned over the years, the photos of company milestones and expansion projects. "Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" she asked, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. It was a question I'd been expecting, but I still didn't have a complete answer. "At first, it didn't seem important," I said. "The business was small, uncertain. I didn't want to make it sound more significant than it was. And then, as it grew, the gap between what you assumed and what was true became so wide that correcting it would have required explaining why I'd never corrected it before. Jessica nodded slowly. It was easier to let me think what I wanted to think. That's part of it. But there was something else too. You seemed to need me to be struggling. It gave you a sense of purpose, having a mother to worry about and help. I didn't want to take that away from you. But Mom, that wasn't actually helping me. That was enabling me to feel superior without earning it. The insight was painful but accurate. By allowing Jessica to maintain her misconceptions, I had inadvertently encouraged a relationship dynamic based on condescension rather than mutual respect. During the following weeks, Jessica began asking detailed questions about the business, about my role in its development, about the decisions that had shaped Chen Electronics' growth. She approached these conversations with the same intensity she brought to her marketing work. But now the subject was her own mother's career, rather than a potential client's needs. I keep thinking about that presentation I gave, she said during one of our dinners. All that advice about embracing visibility and self-promotion. I was essentially telling you to fix problems that didn't exist, wasn't I? Your analysis wasn't wrong, I replied carefully. Chen Electronics could probably benefit from higher brand recognition. But you were operating from the assumption that we needed that recognition to be successful when in fact we had chosen to prioritize other things. Like what? Relationships, reliability, long-term thinking over short-term growth. We've built a business that our suppliers trust, that our customers depend on, that provides stable employment for our staff. Those aren't flashy achievements, but they're solid ones. Jessica considered this, perhaps recognizing the parallel to my personal choices. The preference for substance over appearance, for genuine security over visible success. I think I've been confusing marketing with meaning, she said quietly, assuming that if something isn't promoted, it doesn't matter. The conversation represented a fundamental shift in how Jessica understood value and achievement. She was beginning to question the assumptions that had governed not just her perception of my life, but her approach to her own career and goals. This intellectual evolution was accompanied by practical changes in our relationship. Jessica stopped offering unsolicited advice about my living situation or lifestyle choices. She no longer suggested senior housing communities or job training programs. Instead, she began asking questions about my preferences, my plans, my perspective on various topics. "Are you happy living in Queens?" she asked during one visit. "I mean, really happy, not just settling for it?" I explained that I had chosen my apartment deliberately, that I valued its proximity to transportation, its quiet neighborhood character, its reasonable cost that allowed me to save and invest rather than spend on housing I didn't need. "But you could afford something much nicer," Jessica pointed out. "A Manhattan apartment, a house in the suburbs, whatever you wanted." "I could," I agreed, "but I don't want those things enough to spend money on them. I'd rather have financial security and the freedom it provides than an impressive address and the expenses it requires." Jessica absorbed this explanation with the attention of someone learning a foreign language, trying to understand not just the words but the underlying logic that made them meaningful. The most significant change, however, was in how Jessica talked about her own life and career. The desperate edge had disappeared from her voice when she discussed work challenges. She stopped treating every professional setback as a catastrophe and every success as validation of her worth as a person. "I think I was trying to prove something that didn't need proving," she told me during one of our walks through Flushing Meadows Park. "I was so focused on appearing successful that I forgot to ask whether I was actually happy." She had started reconsidering her financial priorities, moving to a smaller but more affordable apartment, buying fewer things she didn't need, focusing on building savings rather than maintaining appearances. "It's funny," she said. "I spent years thinking you needed to learn how to manage money, but I was the one living paycheck to paycheck while you were building wealth." The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but it no longer felt painful. Instead, it had become a source of gentle humor, a reminder of how completely we had misunderstood each other. 3 months after the conference room revelation, Jessica made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She left her marketing firm to start her own consultancy, focusing on helping small businesses develop authentic rather than artificial brand strategies. "I want to work with companies like yours," she explained. "Businesses that are successful because they're good at what they do, not because they're good at talking about what they do. It was, I realized, the first time Jessica had made a major career decision based on her own values rather than external expectations. She was finally building something that reflected who she actually was rather than who she thought she needed to be. The transformation wasn't complete. Relationships built on misunderstanding don't heal overnight, but the foundation had been laid for something more honest, more balanced, more genuinely respectful than what we'd had before. For the first time in years, when Jessica looked at me, she saw someone worth listening to. And when I looked at her, I saw someone ready to hear what I had to say. The invitation arrived on elegant cardstock, delivered by messenger to my office on a crisp October morning in 2014. Jessica's new consultancy was hosting its first annual client appreciation event, and she wanted me there, not as her mother who needed guidance, but as someone whose business experience she genuinely valued. Fleming Strategic Communications cordially invites you to celebrate 1 year of authentic partnerships and sustainable growth, the invitation read. Below, in Jessica's handwriting, she had added, "Mom, I would be honored if you would attend as my guest. I have something special planned. Love, Jessica." The venue was a restored warehouse in Brooklyn, transformed into an elegant but unpretentious event space. As I entered, I was struck by how perfectly the setting reflected Jessica's evolution. The exposed brick and industrial fixtures had been softened with warm lighting and carefully arranged flowers, creating an atmosphere that was sophisticated without being pretentious. Jessica greeted me at the entrance, wearing a midnight blue dress that was beautiful but practical, expensive but not ostentatious. She looked confident in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the aggressive confidence of someone trying to prove themselves, but the quiet assurance of someone who had found their place in the world. "I'm so glad you came," she said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "There are some people I want you to meet." She led me through the crowd, introducing me to her clients and colleagues. But these introductions were different from the awkward meeting at Chen Electronics. Jessica spoke about me with pride and accuracy, describing my role at Chen Electronics, my business experience, my insights into sustainable growth strategies. "My mother taught me that the most successful businesses are often the ones you've never heard of," she told a small group of entrepreneurs. "They focus on serving their customers and building relationships rather than building brand recognition." I listened to Jessica articulate business philosophy with the same clarity and conviction that had once characterized her marketing presentations. But now the content reflected deeper understanding rather than surface-level analysis. The evening's program included a presentation about Jessica's first year in business. She had secured 12 clients, all small to medium-sized companies that shared her commitment to authentic rather than artificial growth. Her revenue was modest compared to her previous salary, but her expenses were lower, her stress levels manageable, and her satisfaction with her work genuine. "When I started this business," Jessica told the assembled group, "I thought success meant growth at any cost, visibility at any price. I've learned that real success is building something sustainable, something that serves your clients' actual needs rather than your own ego." She paused, looking directly at me from the small stage. I learned this from watching someone who had already figured it out, even though I was too busy giving advice to notice. The acknowledgement was public, gracious, and completely unexpected. I felt tears forming in my eyes as I realized that Jessica was finally seeing our relationship clearly, not as a burden she had inherited or a project she needed to manage, but as a source of wisdom she had overlooked. After the formal presentation, Jessica and I found a quiet corner where we could talk privately. The event continued around us, but we were absorbed in our own conversation. "How does it feel?" I asked. "Building something from scratch, being responsible for every decision." "Terrifying and exhilarating," Jessica replied without hesitation. "But also right in a way that my previous job never was. I'm working with people who want to build something meaningful, not just something profitable." She told me about her clients, a family-owned restaurant that wanted to expand without losing its neighborhood character, a tech startup focused on solving actual problems rather than creating artificial demand, a craftsman who made furniture built to last generations rather than years. "They remind me of Chen Electronics," she said. "Businesses that succeed because they're good at what they do, not because they're good at selling themselves." The parallel wasn't coincidental. Jessica had deliberately sought out clients whose values aligned with the business philosophy she had witnessed, but not recognized during her years of dismissing my choices. As the evening wound down, Jessica made an announcement that caught me completely off guard. "I have one more thing to share," she said, addressing the remaining guests. "Fleming Strategic Communications is launching a new service line, succession planning and family business consulting. We'll be helping established companies prepare for transitions, whether that's bringing in new leadership, expanding operations, or planning for the next generation." She looked at me again, and I saw a question in her eyes. "This new service will be led by someone with 30 years of experience building and managing successful businesses, someone who understands that the best leaders are often the ones who work behind the scenes. I'm hoping to convince my mother, Ruth Fleming, to join the team as our senior partner." The room fell silent as everyone processed this unexpected announcement. I felt my heart racing as I realized what Jessica was proposing. Not charity disguised as opportunity, but a genuine business partnership based on mutual respect and complementary skills. Later, as we walked through the quiet Brooklyn streets toward the subway station, Jessica explained her thinking. "I know you're not ready to retire," she said, "and I know you have knowledge and experience that could help other businesses navigate the same challenges you've already solved. This wouldn't be about me helping you find work. This would be about us working together as equals." The proposal was thoughtful, professional, and completely free of the condescension that had characterized Jessica's previous attempts to improve my life. She wasn't trying to rescue me or manage me, she was offering to learn from me. "What would David think?" I asked, knowing that any new venture would require his approval and potentially his blessing. "I already talked to him," Jessica admitted. "He thinks it's a brilliant idea. He said Chen Electronics could be our first client. You could help other family businesses learn from what you and David built together." The conversation continued as we rode the subway back to Queens, discussing practical details, potential challenges, and shared vision for what the partnership might accomplish. For the first time in our adult relationship, we were talking as business equals, each bringing valuable perspective and experience to a collaborative endeavor. When we reached my stop, Jessica surprised me by getting off the train as well. "Mind if I walk you home?" she asked. "It's been a while since I've seen the neighborhood." We strolled through the familiar streets of my Queens neighborhood, past the corner grocery store where I had shopped for decades, past the small park where I took my evening walks, past the modest apartment building I had chosen to call home. "You know what I realized tonight?" Jessica said as we approached my building. "This neighborhood, your apartment, the way you live, it's not settling for less. It's choosing what matters." She paused at the entrance to my building, looking up at the simple brick facade with new understanding. "All those years I thought you needed to want more, but you had already figured out what enough looked like." As I watched Jessica disappear into the subway station, heading back to her own apartment in Brooklyn, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. We had traveled from misunderstanding to revelation, from condescension to respect, from artificial distance to genuine partnership. The path hadn't been straightforward or easy. It had required confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves and each other, abandoning assumptions that had provided false comfort, and building new ways of relating based on reality, rather than projection. But standing in front of my building, thinking about Jessica's proposal and the possibilities it represented, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the excitement of building something new with someone who finally understood what I had to contribute. Tomorrow, I would call David to discuss the details of Jessica's proposal. We would need to work out the logistics of my potential involvement in a new venture while maintaining my responsibilities at Chen Electronics. There would be contracts to negotiate, expectations to clarify, boundaries to establish. But tonight, I simply felt gratitude for the daughter who had finally learned to see me clearly, and for the second chance we had both earned through patience, honesty, and the willingness to start over with the truth. 6 months after Jessica's proposal, I found myself sitting in a conference room I had never imagined would exist. The headquarters of Fleming Strategic Communications, located in a renovated office building in Long Island City that offered stunning views of the Manhattan skyline. The nameplate on the door read, "Ruth Fleming, Senior Partner," and every time I saw it, I felt a quiet sense of completion. The decision to join Jessica's firm hadn't been immediate or simple. David and I had spent weeks working out the details of my transition from full-time to consulting status at Chen Electronics. We structured an arrangement that allowed me to maintain my ownership stake while shifting my daily responsibilities to focus on strategic planning and mentoring rather than operational management. "You've earned the right to choose your own adventure," David had said during one of our planning sessions. "Chen Electronics will always be your company, but maybe it's time to help other people build their own." The partnership with Jessica had evolved naturally from professional collaboration to genuine friendship. We discovered that our different approaches to business, her strategic marketing mind and my operational experience, complemented each other perfectly. More importantly, we had learned to communicate without the layers of assumption and defensive positioning that had characterized our relationship for so many years. Our first major client was a fourth-generation Italian restaurant chain that was struggling with expansion decisions. The founder's great-granddaughter wanted to modernize and grow rapidly, while the older family members feared losing the authentic character that had made them successful. "This feels familiar," Jessica had whispered to me during our initial meeting with the family, as we watched 3 generations argue about tradition versus innovation. Working with the restaurant family, I recognized patterns I had seen in my own relationship with Jessica. The younger generation's impatience with what they perceived as outdated thinking, the older generation's concern that change would mean abandoning core values. Over the course of 3 months, we helped them develop an expansion strategy that honored their culinary traditions while embracing modern operational efficiency. The solution wasn't choosing between tradition and innovation, but finding ways to strengthen their foundation while building carefully toward the future. "You saved our family business," the patriarch told us at the conclusion of our engagement. "But more than that, you taught us how to listen to each other." The comment stayed with me long after the contract ended. Jessica and I had helped repair a family's communication by applying lessons we had learned from repairing our own. Our client base grew steadily, drawing businesses that had heard about our unique approach to family-owned enterprises and succession planning. Each engagement taught us something new about the delicate balance between continuity and change, between honoring the past and embracing the future. One afternoon, as we were reviewing proposals for potential new clients, Jessica looked up from her laptop with an expression I had learned to recognize, the face she made when processing something significant. "Mom, can I ask you something that's been bothering me?" I set down my own work and gave her my full attention. "When you were building Chen Electronics, when you were making all those strategic decisions and managing complex operations, did you ever feel invisible? Like your accomplishments didn't count because nobody outside the company knew about them?" The question revealed how deeply Jessica had been thinking about success, recognition, and the relationship between achievement and visibility. "Sometimes," I answered honestly. "Especially during the early years, when other people's children were getting promoted at big companies or starting families, and I couldn't explain what I was doing without it sounding insignificant." "How did you handle that?" I thought about the late nights spent reviewing contracts, the weekend strategy sessions with David, the quiet satisfaction of watching the company grow month by month, year by year. "I learned to measure success differently," I said. Instead of asking whether other people recognized my achievements, I started asking whether the work itself was meaningful, whether it was building something lasting, whether it was helping people I cared about. Jessica nodded slowly. "I think I spent so many years chasing external validation that I forgot to ask whether I was proud of what I was actually doing." It was a profound insight, and one that had taken both of us decades to reach. The conversation continued as we discussed the difference between accomplishment and recognition, between building something valuable and building something visible. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the office, Jessica made an announcement that surprised me once again. "I've been thinking about our business model," she said. "I want to start offering some of our services pro bono to small family businesses that can't afford consulting fees. Not as charity, but as community investment." The proposal was vintage Jessica, thoughtful, strategic, and driven by values that had evolved from her earlier focus on profitability at any cost. "What made you think of that?" I asked. "Working with these families has made me realize how many businesses never get the help they need simply because they can't afford it." But those are often the businesses that matter most to their communities, the ones that employ local people and serve local needs. We spent the next hour developing a framework for what Jessica dubbed the Community Partnership Program. We would select several small businesses each year to receive strategic planning and succession consulting at no charge, funded by the profits from our paying clients. "It's like what you did with Chen Electronics," Jessica observed, "building something that creates value for everyone involved, not just the owners." The parallel hadn't occurred to me, but Jessica was right. The program reflected the same philosophy that had guided my approach to business for 30 years. The belief that true success comes from creating sustainable value rather than extracting maximum profit. As winter turned to spring in 2015, Fleming's strategic communications continued to grow, but in ways that felt organic rather than forced. We hired 2 additional consultants, both experienced professionals who shared our commitment to authentic rather than artificial growth. We moved to a larger office space that could accommodate our expanding team while maintaining the collaborative atmosphere that had become our trademark. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways I hadn't expected. Each client brought unique problems that required creative solutions, but the underlying themes were consistent. How do you honor the past while building for the future? How do you maintain core values while adapting to changing circumstances? How do you build something that lasts? These were questions I had been answering for decades, but I had never articulated the lessons in ways that could help other people. Working with Jessica gave me the opportunity to share insights that had previously existed only in my own experience. More importantly, our partnership had given both of us something we hadn't realized we were missing: the opportunity to work together as equals, to combine our different strengths in service of shared goals, to build something meaningful together. 1 year after joining Jessica's firm, I was featured in a trade publication article about women entrepreneurs over 60. The reporter had been intrigued by my transition from corporate executive to startup partner, and she wanted to understand what had motivated the change. "Ruth Fleming has spent her career building successful businesses," the article read. "But her latest venture with her daughter Jessica represents something different: the chance to share decades of wisdom while continuing to learn and grow." Jessica framed a copy of the article and hung it in our conference room, next to photos of our team and certificates from satisfied clients. But the recognition that mattered most wasn't public. It was the daily experience of working with someone who finally understood and valued what I brought to our partnership. On a quiet Friday afternoon in late spring, as we were reviewing quarterly financials that showed steady growth and healthy profit margins, Jessica looked up from her spreadsheet with a familiar expression of realization. "You know what I think we've accomplished?" she said. "We've built something that would make you proud even if nobody ever wrote about it, even if it never got famous or won awards." She was right. Fleming's strategic communications represented the same principles that had guided my work at Chen Electronics: sustainable growth, authentic relationships, long-term thinking over short-term gain. But more than that, it represented the possibility of rebuilding trust after profound misunderstanding, of creating new foundations on solid ground. As I locked the office and headed home to Queens that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The path from embarrassingly poor to equal partner hadn't been straight or simple, but it had been transformative for both of us. Jessica had learned that success isn't always visible, that wisdom doesn't always announce itself, that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected sources. I had learned that keeping secrets, even well-intentioned ones, can damage the very relationships we're trying to protect. But perhaps most importantly, we had both learned that it's never too late to start over with the truth, to build something new on the foundation of who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. The work continues, the partnership grows stronger, and every day brings new opportunities to help other families avoid the misunderstandings that nearly destroyed our own. Some stories end with dramatic revelations or sudden transformations. Ours ended with something better: the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful together, one honest conversation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.